Hello everyone, Golden Nova here. Last week we talked about Gravekeepers, covering every card in the theme but one. And while that usually goes against my policy of making sure that every card of that video's archetype gets in, I think you'll see why we had to give Ishizu's cards their own space. While not having very many duels on screen, Ishizu Ishtar is nonetheless one of the most powerful duelists in the cast due to a powerful ancient artifact in their possession, the Millennium Necklace, which in and of itself is probably the most potent among the Millennium items when it comes to getting a leg up on the competition. I know the Millennium Eye is very flashy, being able to read your opponent's mind. Even though it took some occult trickery, it's certainly not infallible. It can only read the mind of the opponent you're immediately up against, and only in that moment. But what if you had the power to look into the future and see what your opponent would do even before they knew they were going to do it? True, the necklace's prognostication was defeated by Tributing God, so it won't guarantee your win either, but it would take an opponent with a strong enough will to bend fate to their own design to overcome it, and I think that's outside the realm of most duelists, whether ye be from the anime or no. And while Ishizu's brief time dueling didn't give us much to work with card-wise, they were recently given a fresh coat of paint and inadvertently became one of the most powerful engines the game had ever seen. And while the cards will swear up and down that they're meant to facilitate Ishizu's specific win condition, there's a few decks that enjoy the help. And by a few, I mean basically every single goddamn one out there. So how did Ishizu's strategy turn from Dark Crisis Common Bulk to Magnificent Milling Maidens? Well, that's what we're here to teach you. We'll take a look at some very important guests, see what the future has in store for us, then meet the companions we always knew would join our cause. I predict you're gonna have a great time with Exchange of the Spirit Explained. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons and the fine people over at Dragon Shield, if you want to protect your subscription. So, what's the deal with Exchange of the Spirit? Well, in the anime, this was Ishizu's ace in the hole, letting her limit Kaiba's deck to only a few cards, funneling him down into the options that would have won her the game had it not been for Millennium Rod shenanigans. It's a normal trap card whose original text reads, "You can only activate this card by paying 1,000 life points while there are 15 or more cards in your grave. Both players swap the cards in their grave with the cards in their deck, then shuffle the cards in each new deck and put it in the deck zone." God, I love old terminology. So, since Kaiba used a boatload of virus cards to mill Ishizu's deck, getting rid of all of her cards, she basically Uno reverses it right back on Kaiba, leaving him with only the cards remaining in his hand, as well as whatever cards he had used to set up that situation in his deck, with everything else being shunted into the grave, putting Kaiba dangerously close to deck out. But, as you simply play a boatload of draw cards to churn through your entire deck, eventually finding a way to bin the monster Machiora the Destructor, which at the time allowed you to activate any number of trap cards from your hand during the turn it was sent to the graveyard from anywhere. This opened up more draw options like Jar of Greed and Reckless Greed, and eventually you'd find Exchange of the Spirit, which you could also play from hand because of the Machiora effect. And as long as you'd gone first, ensuring your opponent didn't have any cards in grave, you could just pass turn and they'd lose in the draw phase. Thankfully, both cards have since been eroded, with Machiora only letting you activate one trap card in hand the turn it's sent from the monster zone to the grave, and Exchange of the Spirit only being able to activate if both players have 15 or more cards in their graves, as well as slapping on a nifty once per duel restriction. This more or less defeats the purpose of running this card on the surface, though it can still recycle your used cards if need be, while giving you an option to essentially seal away anything in your opponent's grave, though they will have the opportunity to use the grave effects of anything that was in the deck before the swap. Though, thankfully, swapping cards between the deck and grave does not count as sending cards to the grave, so at least you're not going to see a rush of Burning Abyss triggers. However, the new wave of Ishizu support can help with reestablishing this card's deadly power, so be on the lookout for those. Trust me, it's one gift you definitely don't want to bring to the exchange. Now, because a lot of Ishizu's older cards are, bad, Exchange of Despair and Hope, a normal trap card that you can activate if you control 3 or more Earth Fairy monsters. Send as many monsters from the field to the grave as possible, minimum 1, then each player can special summon monsters from their opponent's grave to their own field, up to the number of monsters sent to their opponent's grave. Then, if a monster was special summoned by this effect and Exchange of the Spirits is in your grave, you can set a trap card directly from your deck and it can be activated this turn. Spoilers, but Ishizu's monsters are Earth Fairies, so the idea is to assemble 3, activate this card, essentially gift your opponent as many monsters as you had from your grave, while you get to have as many monsters from their grave as they sent. Which might sound like a pretty even trade, but trust me, we can get really silly with it. And then you get full effect because it can be almost anything. It could even be an exchange of the spirit. You know how much we've always wanted one of those. Blast Held by Destiny is a normal trap card that can be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack. Destroy the one monster your opponent controls with the highest attack, your choice of Tide, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to its original attack. Then, if Exchange of the Spirit is not in your grave, take damage equal to the damage they took. And if this card is sent from the hand or deck to the grave, you can target a level 4 Earth Fairy monster in your grave and add it to your hand. This is a reference to the card Blast Held by a Tribute, but wow, is this new card way better. The old card only triggers when an opponent's tribute summoned monster attacks, so you know, that's not going to happen often, and only burns for 1,000, which is going to be less attack position monsters, and you don't have to worry about the burn damage being reflected onto you. But I think they had to include it to keep with the old card. And they did it in a really cool way, making it a nifty tribute to Kaiba's Ring of Destruction, one of your on-theme monsters, which will enable their effects again for even more value. And with the amount of cards you'll be milling, it'll happen eventually, so you won't have to worry about relying on your density. Wait. Gravekeeper's Trap is a continuous trap card, and while Exchange of the Spirit is in the grave, your opponent can't activate the effects of cards in the grave or special summon monsters from the grave. During the main phase, you can discard a card to add a Gravekeeper's or Earth Fairy monster from your deck to your hand, and during your opponent's draw phase, before their normal draw, if this card is already face up on the field, declare a card name, look at the cards drawn for their normal draw, and if it was the declared card, send it to the grave. Okay, so maybe this does have some utility in Gravekeepers, letting you trade out a card in hand for any on-theme monster, but that's about it. The important part is everything else. The effect and summoning lockdown from Grave is huge, keeping your opponent from accessing a variety of powerful effects while you get to keep all your own. Not to mention that you get to search your on-theme monsters while potentially triggering their effects. The last part of the card is another reference, both to Ishizu's ability to tell the future and her card Muko. You're probably not going to get this right 99% of the time, but A, you'll feel like a genius when you do, and B, the important part is that you know what your opponent is drawing, so you gain knowledge of what they've got at their disposal, making any of their counterplays null and void. Okay, next up we have our monsters, the next 4 of which being very important. They can be split into 2 groups. The Millers, named for how if sent from the hand or deck to the graveyard, you can mill both players' decks by 5, plus an additional 5 from either player's deck if Exchange of the Spirit is in your grave at resolution. And the Shufflers, which comes from how they can be banished from the field or grave as a quick effect to shuffle up to 3 cards in either grave back into the deck, or up to 5 if Exchange of the Spirit is in the grave or on the field, a very particular wording that we'll expound upon in a bit. Though I will say that their ability to mess with the amount of monsters you have on board, as well as the monsters in your grave, means you can effectively cheat all the downsides of Exchange of Despair and Hope, so, you know, there's that. They're all based on older Ishizu cards that, given their power level, may as well be vanillas, and while they might not seem like a good foundation to build a retrain off of, you'll be delighted to know that all of them are on the FNL list in any format they're a part of in some way, mostly material. Let's begin with our Millers, and first up we've got Agido! The Ancient Sentinel, who has 1500 attack and 1300 defense. If any number of cards are sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's grave, except during the damage step, you can special summon, which references the original Agido, which can potentially summon a fairy from your grave when destroyed by a battle and sent to the grave, but only if its level matches the amount that you roll on a 6-sided die, unless you roll a 6, in which case you're just good with it. As for the Ancient Sentinel itself, whenever you cause your opponent to mill, or your opponent is in a mood to discard, Agido can jump out of your hand and grab a friend, at the hand or deck, but if you have another Agido to mill, that'll still trigger because the effects are not mutually exclusive. This can get especially out of hand if your opponent is going first and they mill you, because this could end up netting you 2 material before you even start your first turn, and that is a great place to be at. Just be careful against any deck that likes the grave. So, you know, most decks, as this can end up giving your opponent some value as well, since you can't choose to exclude your opponent. So really, every usage of this card is one big roll of the dice. Kelbeck, the Ancient Vanguard, has 1500 attack and 1800 defense, and if any number of cards are sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's grave, except during the damage step, you can target a special summoned monster your opponent controls. Special summon this card from your hand, then return that targeted monster to the hand. This is based on the original Kelbeck, which returns to hand a monster that attacked it after damage calculation. But whereas that card is a cheap knockoff of Legendary Jujutsu Master or Heavens Forbid Wall of Illusion, Ancient Vanguard is a powerful hand trap that can disrupt a plethora of cards. While you're able to manually force this with your own discard or mill effects targeted at your opponent will find many ways of doing that on their own. Branded players, be aware of activating Fusion because that will bring down the Wrath of Keldo, bouncing the Lubellion or Albion you just summoned so you can't use them as part of your Fusion summon lines. And Tearlaments are constantly in danger of enabling this card, and the bounce is one of the best ways to deal with their fusions, making this a great way to set your opponent Kelbeck to square one. Next up, we have our Shufflers. Keldo, the Sacred Protector, has 1200 attack and 1600 defense, and you can discard one other Earth Fairy monster to special summon this card from your hand. Then add an Exchange of the Spirit, or a card that mentions it, from your deck to your hand. Strangely enough, that effect isn't a reference to the original Keldo, but rather the entire concept of the Shuffler seems to be based on it, since the original card shuffles cards from your opponent's grave back into the deck, which is pretty bad there, but pretty neat for us. As for the search effect, not only will it trigger the effect Destiny Blast, or grab any other monster that's part of this rotation. Heck, you can even grab a copy of Keldo since it doesn't exclude itself for some reason. And then, once that's all done, you'll have gone net neutral in card advantage while getting a level 4 monster on board, which you can use for a variety of purposes. Not least of which being its shuffling effect, which, ignoring how it was used competitively, is what makes Exchange of the Spirit work in the modern. Spirit is on the field, otherwise an odd thing to do for normal trap cards that don't stick around, and now your opponent has less cards in their grave to make up their new deck. And while activating 2 maximum power shufflers will still leave their grave with a minimum of 5 cards, that's still pretty close to the end of the road, and nothing speed. Though I don't think calling it a protector makes sense anymore, because if anything, Keldo woke up and chose violence. Mudora, the Sword Oracle, has 1500 attack and 1800 defense, and you can discard one other Earth Fairy monster to spec your deck face up in your spell and trap zone. This is the first monster we have here that doesn't have a reference effect to its old version, but all it does is gain attack for each fairy in your grave, so at least that, since Gravekeeper's Trap is itself a searcher, card draw scouter, and can potentially lock out your opponent's grave, all while giving you a monster to help you with your magic. I don't know if anyone out there does it quite like Mudora, and with blades like that, I'm confident in saying we're not going to see anyone like that anytime soon. Next up, we have a few cards that are just off to the right. Zolga the Prophet has 1700 attack and 1200 defense, and if you control an Earth Fairy, except a copy of this card, you can special summon this card from your hand, then look it up to 5 cards from the top of each player's deck. When a monster that was normal summon, you do inflict 2000 damage to your opponent. This is pretty much the inverse of original Zolga, which gets you 2000 life points if a monster is tribute summoned by tributing it. So this means we get another reference to blast held by a tribute, and it's even more flavorful here since Zolga was the monster that passed the blast off to Obelisk. Though in this card's case we can use this more proactively, and while we still lose the monster, 2000 points of burn damage isn't nothing. But if you don't want to go through all that hassle, Prophet Zolga still makes for a great extender, getting you more level 4 material on board and gives you advanced knowledge of both players' top decks for the next few turns, which not Alright, so that's all of our cards, but what do we do with them? Well, the cards themselves are all about performing a more fair version of the Spirit Exchange FTK, so you can still kind of play it as you used to, though instead you'll have to find a way to get Machiora onto the board and send him to the grave from there, and even if you do that, you can only really use Exchange of the Spirit with it. This means jamming in as many draw cards as possible, preferably things like hand and card destruction that get cards into your opponent's grave, that way you can save your millers for the grand finale. However, for the game plan, and what decks benefit from having some collaboration with ancient Egyptian spirits. Cardawn the Clear-Sighted fits into our Earth Fairy theme, and while it doesn't have a ton of synergy with us, it can bring Gravekeeper's Trap right out of the grave and let you use it immediately. And if Cardawn goes to the grave, you can ensure it stays safe for a number of turns. It even has some anime flavor because this can bring back a number of continuous trap monsters that were used by the Ishtar family. From the menacing Metal Reflect slime that's about 2 seconds away from transforming into Egyptian god slime, to embodiment of Apophis, or even Apophis, deity of the swamp, which is much bigger and potentially has some negates attached to it. Since our entire theme is Earth attribute, we can pretty easily play Vernisylphs. No, we still mean the other green and pink haired fairies. Vera, who can control the board until we've set up the right conditions for victory. Other Earth Fairies we could use are World Soul Carbon, which is effectively a searcher for all of our cards, and Thrawn, which can act as an extender whenever we discard our monsters. Agito's In-Hand effect can summon any Earth Fairy, so any deck that has those and likes the graveyard has something to enjoy. One of them being Madolche, not only filling up your grave to help with Hootcake's effect, but letting you summon back Angeli or Petting Sisir, both of which have amazing effect. Toy Vendors, summoning Dog searches out basically every card in that deck. As for another deck that loves these cards, well, the most obvious is the one that menaced the format for a long time, Tearlaments. Yeah, it turns out when you print a deck that works well with sending a ton of your cards to the grave, and then you print a whole extra set of cards that enable that, and you give them all bonkers effects, the deck is going to be pretty good. Not only do Agito and Kelbeck fill up your grave really quickly, the ability to pull back your own resources so you can gain access to them later on. It even synergizes with Palreno to force the pop effect in a pinch. But with just about every meaningful card from these two themes being decimated on the ban list, don't expect it to see it consistently at the top tables again like it did in the past. Now, since we skipped over this last episode, how well does Gravekeeper's Trap work with how do we square that circle? Well, I would argue that the Exchange of Spirit cards work as a good complement to Necro Valley. If you can get Gravekeeper's Trap on the field and get Exchange of Spirit into the graveyard, it covers one of Necro Valley's blind spots. That being, it still allows effects in graveyard to activate. And if your opponent gets rid of Necro Valley, then you have a bunch of shufflers that are now live that can disrupt your opponent's grave until you're able to re-establish your field spell. This need a discard in hand like Mudora and Keldo, but a majority of them are level 4, so at the very least they can come together to provide great material for extra deck monsters that can be bolstered by the lack of an opponent's graveyard options. Archlord Christia also makes for an excellent addition to the deck. While the random milling might mess with your fairy count, thankfully the shufflers, so long as you don't require a flexible extra deck, you can use this to send a Gem Knight and any of your millers to the grave to get an effect trigger. Heck, Gem Knight Quartz itself is an Earth Fairy, so it's to attempt to mill your opponent out of the game. You can also go for that Gem Knight FTK for the ultimate in uninteractive Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's all I have to say about the Exchange of the Spirit cards. While mechanically they make sense for helping to enable the card's full power, they were clearly released at a time where those effects intersected with some horrendously powerful decks, to say nothing that they provided some of the best enabling effects in the whole game, period. It's almost surprising, that they even saw print in the first place, and I worry what this means for the next age of power creep if this is the kind of stuff that can get through R&D. But with their power cards firmly cemented on the FNL list, you won't be seeing them haunting a format anytime soon. And now, I want to hear what you all have to say. Are these cards fine to return to the land of the living, or is there no future for them? And what deck did you like playing them with most? I didn't get to use them very much myself, but having them in branded was pretty cool. Let me know in the comments, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like the video to boost it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Today's episode was brought to you in part by Dragon Shield. When you want to protect your cards with the power of dragon scales, get some sweet lore for them, and support the channel, check out my link in the description to get started. Today's episode was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commander Green Knight, Nebula Navigator's 3rd Dynasty, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Andrew Newman, A Random Pup, Avi Chali, Kane Senpai, Chibigo Worldbreaker, Frankie, Genesis Yu-Gi-Oh!, Gloomba 331, Great Big Pillock, Hairbear, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Howling Zangetsu, Iskander 711, John, Jordan, Julius Sneezer, Mana Charge, Marluxia's a Girl, Nathan Vig, Panther J, Rebel King Lucifer, RJ the Jank Monarch, Sammy Haim, Sir Knight JCB, Skybuster Leo, Sophie, apparently, the Fresh Prince of Con Air, the Wizard Moose and Xander Wolfensberger, Cosmic Crusaders Almento 5010, Ariel Kersey, Bear Sharktopus Studios, Beluga Masta, Blue Gem, Chaz Ghost, Chris Kessler, Drachenwald, Emily, Eva Padilla, Herbal D, In the House Like Carpet, Inblink, Jester Designs, Kale the Dragon, Carp, Kevon Public, King Scarlet Yu-Gi-Oh!, Lord Whoop-De-Doo, Manga Pages, Marion James E. Picata, Nitromo, Ruxeth Sarani, Shizuki Nijimura on the monthly custom card review stream, and, of course, support the channel. Please consider checking out the link to my Patreon in the description or becoming a YouTube member. And if you want to see what Ishizu's clan is up to, check out this video I made covering Gravekeepers. Thank you all so much for watching.